10 years after the Wright brothers' first flight, a new type of aircraft emerged, one that would dominate both commercial and military aviation for the next 40 years. The flying boat. A brainchild of aviation pioneer Glenn Curtiss, it became an American legend that rose and faded with time. It was born in an era when only water could support large aircraft. By the second decade of powered flight, flying boats had become the first airliners, the first American aircraft to see combat, and the first to cross the Atlantic by air. The freedom of flight is unmatched. For any pilot looking down at the land, passing far below is a liberating experience, just as it was for the early pioneers of powered flight nearly a century ago, when they first conquered the skies. But what goes up must come down. While the sky above is boundless, finding a suitable landing surface is not. Today, some pilots believe only one type of aircraft truly embodies the freedom of flight: the seaplane. Unrestricted by fixed airstrips, it can reach some of the most remote corners of the world. As long as there's water, there's a runway. This is Keuka Lake, one of the smaller Finger Lakes in upstate New York. Over 80 years ago, a type of seaplane was developed here that would dominate the first 5 decades of powered flight. The term seaplane generally applies to any aircraft designed for water operations. The commonly seen footplane is essentially a land plane equipped with pontoons instead of wheels. It remains one of the last surviving water-based aircraft, only a faint reflection of its larger counterpart, the flying boat. Unlike the floatplane, the flying boat's hull rests directly on the water. For decades, these large seaplanes were the backbone of both military and commercial aviation, remaining vital until the end of World War II. Some of the most famous and beloved aircraft were flying boats, including the legendary China Clipper. Today, these classics have nearly vanished, but in their time they were among the most advanced aircraft, offering unmatched size and range compared to land planes. This was made possible by the brilliant and innovative mind of one of aviation's greatest pioneers, Glenn Hammond Curtiss. Second only to the Wright brothers in aviation history, Curtiss was a genius in his own right. A self-taught aeronautical engineer, he achieved numerous aviation firsts. He was a true small-town American hero. Born in 1878 in Hammondsport, New York, Curtiss developed an early passion for bicycles. As a teenager, he rode up and down the hills around Hammondsport, building his strength to the point where he began competing and winning races. At 20, Curtiss opened his own bicycle shop, and it wasn't long before he began fitting gas-powered engines to his bikes. People said Glenn was addicted to speed. In 1907, he earned the title of the fastest man on Earth, setting a motorcycle speed record of 136 miles per hour. The Curtiss name was quickly becoming synonymous with superior engineering. Meanwhile, another kind of machine had already made history 3 years earlier. The Wright brothers had successfully flown the first mechanically powered airplane. However, their obsessive secrecy surrounding its development led many Americans at the time to question the legitimacy of their claims. Renowned for his motorcycle engines, Glenn Curtiss caught the attention of the famous Dr. Alexander Graham Bell, who invited him to join the Aerial Experiment Association. The 5-member group, guided by Dr. Bell, set out to study the mechanics of flight, with each member designing and flying his own airplane. Curtiss was appointed director of experiments, and the aircraft were to be built at his plant in Hammondsport. The first two designs flew successfully over short distances, but Curtiss's aircraft clearly outperformed the rest. His creation, the Junebug, performed so well that the AEA decided to compete for the Scientific American Trophy, awarded for the first public flight of 1 kilometer or more. On July 4, 1908, Curtiss piloted the Junebug over 5,000 feet, far exceeding required distance to claim the trophy. A crowd of journalists, scientists, and officials had witnessed the flight. It was now a matter of record. In the public's mind, man could truly fly. From that moment on, the quiet inventor who loved to tinker would be forever linked to the advancement of aviation. Hammondsport lies on the edge of Keuka Lake, in the heart of New York's wine country. In the fall of 1908, Curtiss removed the wheels from his Junebug and replaced them with two canoe-like floats. To the other AEA members, his intentions were obvious.
If you look at this valley where they're experimenting, they're relatively small fields. They had to fly over some rather forbidding country, including vineyards. And if you've seen vineyards from the air, you know it's an inhospitable surface. And I know Curtiss had to fly over this. So I think when he compared what they were flying over and wanting to continue experimenting, that's why he wanted to see if they couldn't possibly fly off water. Another thing, as aviation developed, there were very few flying fields, but there were lots of lakes.
It made perfect sense. Keuka Lake provided a calm, smooth surface and an effectively limitless runway. The aircraft, named Loon, sat catamaran-style on the water. It had no trouble skimming across the lake's surface, but it simply wouldn't take off. A more powerful engine was installed, yet the problem remained. The flat-bottomed, triangular floats couldn't break free from the lake's surface tension. After a float was damaged during testing, further development of a water-based aircraft was shelved, but not forgotten. The idea of launching an airplane from water was far from new. As early as 1905, French aviation pioneers Gabriel Voisin and Louis Blériot experimented with seaplane gliders on the River Seine. Then, in 1910, French marine engineer Henri Fabre became the first to successfully take off and land on water in an airplane. Though lack of funding halted further development, Fabre went on to manufacture floats for future aircraft, including amphibians like this one. Meanwhile, the world was captivated by the most spectacular aviation display yet seen. In 1909, the first international air meet was held in Reims, France. Over 200,000 spectators watched as young American Glenn Curtiss outflew Europe's finest aviators. His latest aircraft, the Reims Flyer, was powered by an 8-cylinder, 51-horsepower engine. Upon takeoff, Curtiss amazed the crowd with his speed, 47 miles per hour. Beating Louis Blériot by 40 seconds, Curtiss claimed the Gordon Bennett Trophy and captured the world's attention. The hero of Hammondsport had become an international sensation. Back home, the military had finally begun to recognize the airplane's value. In September 1908, at Fort Myers, Virginia, the Wright brothers demonstrated their improved aircraft to the U.S. Army. Among the spectators were 2 U.S. naval officers who quickly realized that the Navy, too, should acquire its own aircraft. But at the time, the Navy was not ready to embrace the idea. Within 3 years, however, it would not only obtain its first aircraft, but also establish a naval air facility in the small town of Hammondsport, New York. By late 1910, Glenn Curtiss convinced the U.S. Navy to let one of the exhibition pilots attempt a takeoff from a wooden deck mounted on the bow of the USS Birmingham. 2 months later, on January 18, 1911, the same pilot, Eugene Ely, successfully landed a Curtiss Punisher on a platform built over the stern of the USS Pennsylvania. Surely, the Secretary of the Navy could not ignore the significance of these groundbreaking demonstrations. Yet, he dismissed the idea, stating that such a capability had little practical use for a surface fleet. Undeterred by the Navy's lack of interest in aviation, Curtiss took a different approach. He offered to train a naval officer, free of charge, in both the operation and construction of his aircraft. The Navy accepted, sending Lieutenant Theodore Spuds Ellison to North Island, San Diego, where Curtiss had established a winter facility. The Navy accepted, sending Lieutenant Theodore Spuds Ellison to North Island, San Diego, where Curtiss had established a winter facility. Ellison proved to be a quick learner, but his fascination soon shifted to Curtiss's latest endeavor, an aircraft capable of operating from water. On the flat, sandy beaches of North Island, the two men worked together to overcome the challenges of taking off from the water. Finally, success. On January 26, 1911, their hydro airplane lifted off the water, flew a short distance, and landed. They had found the ideal float design, a single 12-foot-long, 2-foot-wide planing float with an upturned lip. For the next month, they refined the overall design until Curtiss was ready to make one final pitch to the Navy. On February 17th, Curtiss contacted the captain of the USS Pennsylvania, anchored in San Diego Bay. This was the same ship where the remarkable landing and takeoff had taken place the previous month. Since then, the Secretary of the Navy had made it clear that no official consideration would be given to naval aviation until an aircraft could be lowered over the side by a ship's crane, take off, and then return alongside to be hoisted aboard. In front of the commander and crew, Curtiss landed the aircraft next to the ship, attached the crane hook to a sling he had prepared earlier, and rode on the top wing as it was lifted aboard. After a brief visit, the process was reversed, with the aircraft being lowered back onto the water. Curtiss had met all the Secretary's conditions. The Navy would now have its first aircraft. In July of 1911, the Navy accepted the first of 2 hydro airplanes, which had been ordered in May of the same year. The Navy also gained a new pilot, Lieutenant John H. Towers, who began his training under Ellison, who would later become one of the Navy's most influential aviators. Hammondsport soon transformed into a small naval air facility where young Navy officers learned the art of flight from Curtiss. Local residents became accustomed to the sight of strange machines buzzing above Keuka Lake. With the success of the hydro airplane, Curtiss was ready to take the next step in the evolution of waterborne aircraft, a machine that was as seaworthy as it was airworthy, aptly named the Flying Boat.
They felt that it was a more practical configuration, and they started working, really it developed itself because they started working with putting a shield around the hull of the hydroplane, and then they built a pretty flat boat and put the tail on the stern of it. And within less than a year and a half, it evolved into a true flying boat. And it was more sturdy, more rugged, and a more practical arrangement.
The Flying Boat was quite literally a boat that flies. Its hull was designed to withstand the stresses of taking off and landing on water. The single engine, a pusher type like that of the hydro aeroplane, was placed between the 2 wings, which were each fitted with small canister-like floats. The first successful flying boat flew in Hammondsport in July of 1912, but not before Curtiss had to overcome one major challenge. The flat-bottomed hull refused to lift off the water as the old issue of suction that had previously grounded the Loon resurfaced. After observing the hull's angle and the water's flow at various speeds, Curtiss attached two wedge-shaped blocks to the bottom of the hull. The next attempt was a resounding success. The blocks created a break in the flat surface, allowing the aircraft to lift off the water. This step, as it came to be known, would be patented by Curtiss in 1915 and incorporated into every flying boat hull constructed thereafter. In comparison to the hydro aeroplane, the flying boat was vastly superior in size, speed, range, and durability. The Navy quickly placed an order for 5 of these new flying boats. At the same time, Curtiss began marketing his new flying boat to the commercial sector. Targeting wealthy American sportsmen, he advertised it as the Aero Yacht and began attracting affluent customers.
He enjoyed flying himself, and I think he always envisioned that aircraft would be a sporting thing, a field of sportsmen. And he sold the first 2 or 3 to people like McCormick and Vilas, and they flew it for fun. They weren't professionals, they just were flying it for fun. McCormick flew it back and forth from his summer home to his office in Chicago. And the exhibition teams would go out with the flying boats, and they would fly at different yacht clubs.
Priced at $6,000 each, the Aero Yacht was a luxury item for the time. However, wealthy sportsmen were captivated by the sleek new aircraft and eagerly bought them as weekend toys. Many even ordered custom-made versions at considerable expense. As demand surged, production ramped up, and Curtiss invested in new advertising efforts. Some of these customers became well-known and skilled pilots, generating significant publicity for the Curtiss flying boat. The Aero Yacht also gained popularity on the international market, with governments from Britain, Russia, and Japan placing orders. In addition to selling aircraft, Curtiss was operating flight instruction schools in San Diego, Miami, and Hammondsport. The small town of Hammondsport became a vibrant hub for aspiring aviators eager to learn directly from Curtiss. Life was thriving. The world was knocking on his door, seeking flight instruction and purchasing Curtiss airplanes and flying boats. Within 2 years, Glenn Curtiss would design aviation's most ambitious aircraft to date. By late 1913, Curtiss had established himself as a leading figure in American aviation and the largest aircraft manufacturer in the country. The factory at Hammondsport was overwhelmed by the demand for his latest aircraft, the flying boat. That year, aviation pioneer Glenn Curtiss welcomed automobile magnate Henry Ford, who visited to view Curtiss's newest creation. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy began accepting its first flying boats, which would soon be deployed during the Mexican hostilities of 1914. In April 1914, one of Curtiss's flying boats flew over Mexico in search of enemy troops, marking the first American operational flight against hostile forces. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Curtiss's flying boats was selling rapidly to European powers, who were hastily preparing for the onset of World War I. Within the U.S., the flying boat was quickly becoming a favorite among aviators. The U.S. government used them for foreign airmail service, and the first airline was established with a flying boat route between St. Petersburg and Tampa, Florida, in 1914. The advantages of an aircraft capable of operating without an airstrip had clearly caught the public's attention. In April 1913, a wealthy British publisher offered a prize of £10,000 to the first person to fly across the Atlantic Ocean from the United States or Canada to any point in England or Ireland within 72 consecutive hours. By December, American businessman Rodman Wanamaker secretly partnered with Curtiss to finance the design and construction of a transatlantic flying boat. If anyone could accomplish this feat, it was Glenn Curtiss. By then, a skilled British pilot, John Cyril Port, had become closely associated with Curtiss and his flying boat developments. The Curtiss Wanamaker transatlantic flyer was named America, and 2 pilots were chosen, John C. Port from England and U.S. Navy Lieutenant John Towers. One British, the other American, part of Wanamaker's plan to celebrate 100 years of peace and friendship between the U.S. and Great Britain through a historic air crossing. On June 21, 1914, the massive aircraft was ready for its first flight. Lieutenant Towers had been called away by the Navy and was replaced by George Hallett, a skilled pilot and gifted mechanic. Catherine Mason, the daughter of a local vintner, prepared to christen the America at the edge of Keuka Lake, where the town of Hammondsport had gathered to honor its most illustrious son. Powered by 2 90-horsepower pusher-type OX-5 engines, the America was one of the largest aircraft of its time. The upper and lower wings spanned 72 and 46 feet, respectively, while the hull measured 32 feet in length and 4 feet across at its widest point. Curtiss, Hallett, and Port all flew the America with great success. The first leg of the journey across the Atlantic would be the longest, covering 1,200 miles from Newfoundland to the Azores, a small group of islands off Portugal's coast. After refueling, they would continue on to Vigo, Spain, and then finally to Plymouth, England. The amount of fuel needed to reach the Azores added weight to the America, pushing its gross weight to 5,000 pounds. The additional weight prevented the aircraft from being able to lift off the water, causing the flight to be postponed until August. Curtiss decided to install a 3rd tractor-type engine on the upper wing to help get the heavily laden America into the air. The added power solved the liftoff problem, but it introduced another issue: excessive fuel consumption. Aside from mechanical concerns, there were also the challenges of navigation. Aircraft instrumentation was extremely basic at the time. To find the Azores, the crew would have to rely on a sextant, a magnetic compass, and crude drift indicators. There was no radio. They would depend on signal flags from passing ships and, if necessary, carrier pigeons for communication from the aircraft.
He was the real-life model for Tom Swift, the boy inventor and adventurer who was the stuff of dreams for young Americans in the early 1900s. He raced motorcycles and is the only person in history to hold, at the same time, the world speed record on both land and in the air. He turned aviation into a viable business, and his success so infuriated Orville and Wilbur Wright that they sued him for patent infringement. The suit barely slowed him down. By the time he'd retired, he'd manufactured more aircraft than anyone in the world. He is Glenn Curtiss, and he is a legend of air power. Glenn Hammond Curtiss was born in Hammondsport, New York on May 21, 1878. His father and grandfather both died when he was very young, and Curtiss spent the rest of his childhood shuttling back and forth between his mother and grandmother. The two were very different.
Mother was artistic, she was flighty, she couldn't manage money, she painted, she played music, she went out ice skating, she had gentlemen friends, she was an expert driver of horses. Grandma was very hardworking, very practical, she knew how to get along with people.
He worked as a newsboy and as a delivery boy for Western Union. His bicycle, acquired in large measure as a practical money-making tool, became something else entirely to him: It became the mechanism of his escape from his mother's world.
He lived for a while in Rock Stream with his mother, but he really wanted to be with his grandmother in Hammondsport. So that was down a slope and across the valley and up the ridge and then down the other slope. And he bicycled there, and it was speed, speed, speed that he wanted.
As a teen, he built a small business repairing and selling bicycles. But it was the speed of riding that he really loved. He became a well-known bicyclist, racing champion of the Lower Lakes region of upstate New York. Then he saw his first motorcycle. He was amazed how fast it went, and he wanted one of his own. Buying a motorcycle, of course, wasn't possible. He had little money, and motorcycles, which were an experimental technology at the time, weren't easily available. He decided to build one of his own. Curtis converted a bicycle frame and ordered a one-cylinder engine from the Thomas Company. And when it arrived, he discovered that it was little more than a box of rough parts. There was no carburetor and few instructions. With the help of a local machine shop, he built a carburetor, put the engine together, and fastened it to the bicycle frame. When he took it out for a test, the whole town of Hammondsport turned out to see what the noise was all about.
The engine alone weighed 180 pounds, and as he was demonstrating his motorbike, he lost control of it and had to jump off before he careened into a lake.
He learned how to ride it and made enough of an impression on the people of Hammondsport that friends and local businessmen put up the money for Curtis to go into the motorcycle business. In 1902, he opened the G.H. Curtis Manufacturing Company, building and selling the Hercules motorcycle that he designed. He tested the motorcycles himself, pushing the speed higher and higher and inventing technology that allowed the bikes to be lighter and more maneuverable. In 1903, he created the V-Twin, the first two-cylinder motorcycle in the United States.
He took it down to New York City, and he went into a hill climbing race and just demolished the opposition, including professional racers on chain-driven Indian motorcycles. Then he tore across town to Yonkers, jumped into a 10-mile race, won the race, set a new world speed record, and became American amateur champion, all on the same day.
His exploits inspired a series of books for young boys. The books were about Tom Swift, a boy adventurer and inventor who bore a striking resemblance to Curtis.
Tom was a young inventor who had his own factory on the shores of Lake Carlopa in upstate New York. Glenn was a young inventor who had his own factory on the shores of Lake Keuka in upstate New York. Both of them were racers. Both of them started out in motorcycles. So especially in the first few books, it's pretty clear that a lot of the immediate inspiration, anyhow, is the character of Glenn Curtis.
While Curtis experimented with motorcycles, on the dunes of North Carolina, Orville and Wilbur Wright were experimenting with airplanes. In late 1903, they flew, but concerned that others would steal their design, they applied for a patent and hid their plane away. All over the country, however, inventors with different visions were building and testing aircraft. Soon after the Wrights' first flight, Thomas Scott Baldwin bought a Curtis motorcycle engine to power his dirigible, the California Aero. That transaction seems to have kindled in Curtis an interest in aviation. He worked with Baldwin on several other designs, building lighter and lighter engines for Baldwin's blimps. He also kept building motorcycles, and in late 1906 put together a racing bike unlike anything to come before. It was massive, and his only problem now was to find someone to race against.
We went down to Ormond Beach in Florida, and he wheeled out the world's first V8 motorcycle. He put in it a V8 engine he had created for a dirigible. And the officials there said, well, Glenn, this is obviously is not a standard machine, so we can't let you race, but we will give you an official time test.
He revved the machine up, got a rolling start, and covered the mile between the starting and finish lines in just over 26 seconds. His speed, 136.36 miles per hour.
He was literally the fastest man on earth. Not even a locomotive had ever done the mile in that short a time. And it took him another mile to come to a halt after that. So by that time, he was a pretty well-known person, at least if you were interested in speed and mechanics and things like that.
Newspapers around the world covered the astounding achievement. Glenn Curtiss, who'd fallen in love with speed while riding a bicycle to his grandmother's house, had gone faster than anyone had ever gone before, faster even than the fastest locomotive. The only way he was going to go any faster was to do it in the air. 4 years after the Wright brothers first flew, the world of aviation was like a gold rush. Everyone wanted in, though no one knew for sure what the results were going to be. One of those suddenly interested in flying was Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone. He founded the Aerial Experiment Association, a group of aircraft experimenters willing to pool their knowledge and skills to push aviation forward. Bell bought one of Curtiss's aircraft engines for the AEA. He was so impressed by both the engine and Curtiss that he invited the motorcycle racer to join the organization. Curtiss's first impulse was to refuse Bell's offer, but after some thought, he delegated the running of his motorcycle factory to an associate and threw himself full-time into aviation. He signed on to the AEA as Director of Experimentation. While Curtiss was thrilled to be working with Bell, he quickly realized that the inventor's ideas about flight were highly impractical. Bell had spent much of his time developing a 60-foot tetrahedral kite. Curtiss, a successful businessman, saw no way that a kite would ever evolve into a viable product.
He paid attention to a number of areas. First of all, the product itself. And secondly, to the marketing of the product. For instance, let's take the airplane. Now we've got an airplane. Who's going to buy an airplane? Well, we have to market it.
Curtiss believed he could sell airplanes the same way he'd sold motorcycles, by setting records in them. If he made enough headlines, he felt, people would buy airplanes the same way they'd bought motorcycles, by asking for one just like Glenn Curtiss had. He threw himself into designing an airplane. Working with other members of the AEA, the innovations flowed fast and furious. He collaborated on the White Wing, a revolutionary airplane that introduced two critical technologies, wheeled landing gear and a way of steering more practical than the Wright brothers' patented wing warping system. The Wrights had constructed a complicated system of pulleys that pulled the aircraft's wings into different shapes to steer the plane. This wing warping was dependent on brute force, and in some cases required two people struggling with their controls to control the aircraft. Curtiss, working with other AEA engineers, developed a flight control system that required moving only small surfaces attached to the tips and edges of the wings. Those smaller surfaces came to be known as ailerons, and are virtually the same technology used on aircraft today. In 1908, he set out to gain the publicity that he felt would turn aircraft manufacturing into a business. He took his aircraft, the Junebug, out and flew it for the general public. The flight was short, exciting, and made headlines. He made the first straight-line flight of more than 1 kilometer. He became the highest-profile pilot and advocate of flight, and by 1909, he'd outgrown the AEA and set out on his own. He continued with his research, unsuccessfully testing a prototype seaplane, for example, but spent most of his time entering and winning various flying contests. His publicity-centered business strategy infuriated the Wrights, who felt he was usurping their rightful role as the leaders in aviation. They bristled every time he won another headline and fumed when he received recognition they thought should have been their own. But Curtiss kept going. He won the Scientific American Trophy for circular flight and made the first airplane flight in Canada. He became the first licensed aircraft manufacturer and sold the first private aircraft in the United States. And when he went to France to race against a Wright flyer, he set a new world airspeed record.
While he was there, the Wright brothers sued him, and they deliberately timed the suit for his presence at the meet. because they wanted to send a message to everybody in the aviation community. And they were charging him with infringement of their patent. Even though his airplane was very, very different from the Wright's airplane, and in fact superior to the Wright's airplane, they claimed that their patent should be interpreted broadly.
Suddenly, Curtis's embryonic aviation business was in trouble. Customers stopped buying planes because they were worried that the Wrights would sue them too. Legal fees ate into his capital. Desperate, Curtis risked his life answering a newspaper's challenge to aviators. Fly from Albany, the capital of New York State, down the Hudson Valley to New York City in one day and collect a $10,000 prize. All along the route, people poured out of houses to see Curtis's plane. They waved, ran along the roads below him, rang church bells, and blew fire whistles. The trip proved that aircraft could fly dependably between distant points. The public reaction proved Curtis the leading aviator of his time. The $10,000 newspaper prize kept his business alive. The Wright brothers' patent infringement suit, irritating though it was, didn't slow Glenn Curtis down. He made the first flight across Lake Erie and helped fund research on aerial gun sights. He flew the plane as a gun-wielding Army officer, fired the first shots from the air to a target on the ground. Curtis's escapades were more than mere stunts. Militaries around the world were considering adding aircraft to their arsenals, and Curtis wanted that business. There was, he knew, much more at stake than just a few dozen airplane orders.
Back in the very earliest days of airplaning, each manufacturer had his own unique set of cockpit controls, which meant that once you had learned, you were sort of stuck with that technology and with that manufacturer. This created some difficulties. First of all, people killed themselves trying to make the transfer.
Curtis knew that the manufacturer that sold its planes to the emerging Army Air Corps would end up with a huge advantage over other manufacturers. The Army Air Corps would train a large pool of pilots to fly, and what they learned to fly in the Army, they would tend to fly when they got out of the Army. The two dominant control systems were, of course, the Wright brothers' wing warping and Curtis's ailerons. Curtis knew the victor would ultimately control the air.
Eventually, the Wright brothers' control became so complicated that you needed two pilots to fly the airplane. And they each had a separate set of controls and a separate set of things that they did.
The Air Corps settled on Curtis's airplanes and bought a handful to train pilots with. Though the Wright brothers' lawsuit continued, Curtis's aircraft manufacturing business was secure. Curtis trained the first American female pilot, Blanche Stewart Scott, and himself received the first pilot's license issued in the United States. When the Navy got interested in aviation, Curtis earned the title the father of naval aviation by inventing the technology that made naval aviation possible. Eugene Ely, a Curtis pilot in a Curtis plane, made the first takeoff from a ship near Hampton Roads, Virginia. In late 1911, Ely made the first landing on the deck of a ship in San Francisco Bay.
Ely took off from the shore, circled around, and then came in for landing on this very short deck. Fascinatingly, how they made that possible was by getting sandbags and laying them out along both sides of this makeshift deck with ropes tied between each pair of sandbag. And the very first time somebody landed on the deck of a ship, he used a tail hook and caught those ropes and slowed himself down, just as is done today. And a few minutes later, they turned the airplane around, Ely took off, and landed safely ashore.
Curtis trained the first naval aviators and revived an earlier failed experiment by building an airplane that could take off and land on the water. On January 26, 1911, a Navy pilot trained by Curtis took off in the first successful seaplane flight. A few weeks later, Curtis outfitted his seaplane with retractable wheels, allowing it to land on runways. With the help of a New York boat builder, he honed the design down until his seaplane seemed little more than a boat hull with wings. Dubbed the Flying Boat, it promised to open aviation to the whole world.
We have to remember there really were no airports or flying fields or anything like that in the country, in the world back in those days. And to find a long, level field that didn't have a herd of cows or a stand of corn or a barbed wire fence on it was very difficult. So for many people, they say, well, really the water is the surface that we're going to use for landing and taking off.
In 1913, the courts ruled in favor of the Wrights, in effect granting them a patent on the concept of using any type steering system based on wing surfaces moving in opposite directions. The ruling, in effect, gave the Wrights a patent on the fundamental laws of physics. Curtiss, unwilling to give up the progress he was making in flight, worked to get around the patent. He also used every legal means he could to stall, because he'd just put his company to work designing an inexpensive, easily manufactured biplane that he believed would do for aviation what Ford's Model T had done for the automobile. He hired a British airplane designer, D. Douglas Thomas, and put together a team to work on the plane.
So one of the things about Curtiss is he was able to bring in people who had better education and better training than he did and put them to work and keep them to work, and they enjoyed it. They thought it was a great experience to be in. And more Curtiss's work became kind of getting the initial idea and then maybe making some sketches and turning it over to other people to refine.
Curtiss's team worked on two competing designs, the Model N and the Model J. After several years of experiments, in 1914, Curtiss combined the best aspects of the two and introduced the JN-3, which was destined to be one of the most famous aircraft of all time, the Curtiss Jenny.
Within a few months of the time the Jenny was introduced, World War I broke out in Europe. And suddenly the Europeans were in a position of having to train hundreds and then thousands of pilots. So the British placed an order with Curtiss for 250 airplanes.
Though Wilbur Wright, who had been most active in pursuing the suit against Curtiss, had died, the legal wrangling between Curtiss and the Wright Company continued.
Really, the only thing that brought an end to the Curtiss and Wright rivalry was the advent of World War I. And at that point, the U.S. government stepped in and said, guys, we've got to build aircraft. We've all got to work together. We've got to share our ideas. We've got to share our innovations, at least for the duration of the war.
Between 1914 and 1918, Curtiss produced more than 6,000 Jennies. A whole generation of pilots, including Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart, learned to fly in Jennies. And after the war, the surplus aircraft became the favorite of barnstormers around the world.
For many people, it was the first airplane they ever saw, the first airplane they ever rode in, the first airplane they ever piloted.
When the war ended, it became clear that the battle with the Wrights had taken much from Glenn Curtiss. Those around him noticed that he seemed to have lost some of his zeal for innovation. He continued to improve his aircraft. In 1919, 3 of his newest model flying boats set out to cross the Atlantic. Only one made it, the first aircraft to cross an ocean, but the other 2 protected their crews and made it safely to port. But it was also becoming clear by then that Curtiss's mind was wandering from aviation, looking for new challenges. He moved to Florida and dabbled in inventions of local impact. He designed the first streamlined travel trailer, the precursor of hundreds of thousands of recreational vehicles to come. He conceived and built the first airboat, which became a staple of transportation in Florida's Everglades. But mostly, he turned his imagination to the development of real estate. He envisioned paradise and tried repeatedly to create it from the raw material of Florida's warm sunshine and open spaces. Instead of sketching aircraft, he sketched and built whole towns. He played key roles in the development of Hialeah, Opa-locka, and Miami Springs, bedroom communities outside Miami. And in 1930, he received a Medal of Honor for his contribution to aviation. He accepted it gracefully and quietly, a man nearer to the end of his life than anyone knew. He enjoyed flying as a passenger on the plane, reenacting his historic flight down the Hudson Valley.
I think for those who are knowledgeable, most people look at that and say that in many ways Curtiss was the most significant figure of those early aviation years. Fascinatingly, like all of those early pilots, he sort of taught himself to do it. Nobody showed Glenn Curtiss how to fly because nobody else knew.
Glenn Curtiss died in July 1930. He died in Buffalo, New York, of complications after an appendectomy.
He loved flying and he loved aviation, but I think he was partial to the concept of innovation and pushing the envelope. I think he liked to take ideas and machines and envision them not for what they are, but for what they could be.
And that, of all the things Glenn Curtiss left behind, may be his greatest legacy. Viewed from a distance of nearly a century, they don't seem as heroic as they really were. They had funny names, repaired bicycles, and wore three-piece suits to the beach. To the modern eye, they look more like comedians than leading men. But they invented the science of aeronautics, thinking in 3 dimensions when the rest of the world couldn't move beyond 2. They made human flight possible, and every aircraft that has ever flown owes at least something to their work. They are Orville and Wilbur Wright. Wilbur, the older of the Wright brothers, was born April 16, 1867, on a farm in Millville, Indiana. Orville, his younger brother, came along 4 years later. Their father was Milton Wright, a bishop of the United Brethren Church, who could not drive a nail straight into a board. It's really no surprise, then, that the Wrights attributed their engineering aptitude to their mother, Susan Kerner Wright, a shy woman who happily assisted them in the design and construction of numerous childhood projects. For all their similarities, the Wright brothers also were a study in contrast. Wilbur was so shy as to be almost silent in public. He seemed truly happy only when dismantling something mechanical. Orville, on the other hand, was relatively impulsive. He was the idea generator, always coming up with the next project, and something of a dandy. Together, the two formed a well-balanced whole. Orville brought passion and energy, Wilbur persistence and determination. The Wrights' tinkering was accompanied from a very young age by a strong entrepreneurial streak. Orville built kites and sold them to classmates. Wilbur, who worked for the publisher of a church newspaper, invented a machine that automated the folding of papers for mailing. The family moved from Indiana to Dayton, Ohio, where Susan Wright died of tuberculosis in 1889. Wilbur, the dutiful son, nursed her to the end. In 1892, the Wrights opened the Wright Cycle Company to build, repair, and sell bicycles. The business grew quickly, and the seasonal nature of the bicycle business in Ohio afforded the Wrights long winters to experiment. The late 1800s were a boom time for invention. New technologies changed nearly every aspect of life. Improved furnaces and electrical generators made possible household electrification. Wireless telegraphy foreshadowed radio and television. The first practical adding machine served notice of the coming computer age. And the first automobiles appeared on roads previously trod only by horses. But the really big engineering challenge, the problem so daunting that many thought it unsolvable, was heavier than air flight.
Well, Wilbur was the oldest of the two, and he was the one who actually came up with the idea of trying to solve this problem. In the very beginning, Orville just kind of tagged along, but eventually the idea of flight became an obsession to the Wright brothers.
The Wrights were, ironically, inspired to study flight by the failure of Otto Lilienthal. During the early 1890s, Lilienthal had designed and flown 16 different hang gliders. The leading aviator in the world, he died in a crash in 1896. The Wrights saw in Lilienthal's death an opportunity to take the lead in airplane development. Wilbur wrote to the Smithsonian Institution requesting, as he put it, all that is already known about flight experiments. Studying the Smithsonian's pamphlets and books, the Wrights formed some basic ideas about flight. Obviously, an aircraft needed wings to provide lift and power to push the craft forward. But the Wrights added a third element: control. Still struggling just to get off the ground, no one but the Wrights ever considered how to steer a plane once it got off the ground.
I think it's not coincidental that they were bicycle manufacturers, because in recognizing this problem of controllability, what was key for the Wrights was turning. And they recognized that turning an airplane is three-dimensional. You have to change the bank of the airplane, and then you have to change the pitch of the airplane, and you have to kick the nose over. It's really a very, very complex maneuver, if you will, if you think of how an airplane actually turns.
The Wrights noticed that birds change the angle of their wings in order to turn. One wing moved down and the other up in perfect unison, controlling all aspects of their flight at once. The movement was simple enough for a bird, but seemed impossible to mechanically reproduce.
Late one evening when Wilbur was tending to the bicycle shop, and the customer came in and he had problems with the inner tube. And the inner tube came in a long pasteboard box. And while Wilbur was talking to the customer, he found himself with his fingers in each one of those corners of the boxes doing this to it, changing the angle, one up, one down of the corners of the box. And it kind of struck him, this might be a good way of basically just retaining balance for level flight.
The Wrights built a biplane kite, their first experimental aircraft, to test the idea. Using simple hand controls, they were able to make the kite climb, dive, and turn. They knew that what works in models often doesn't on a larger scale, and decided to build a larger glider, one a man could ride in. They also searched for a suitable place to fly it, a place with predictable and moderate winds. Once again, the Wrights did careful research. They wrote to the Weather Bureau in Washington, requested locations that fit their needs, and were provided with a list. The Wrights then sent another round of letters to people at those locations. The only reply they got was from a postman in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina.
In the letter, he described that there were no trees or grass. All this was just beach, deep sand. There were 4 giant sand dunes like the one you see that where the monument is on to launch gliders off of. Very hard to get here, sailboat to the Outer Banks. Then once you got here, there was nobody around. Privacy, secrecy, isolation, but then they would find here where they couldn't find anywhere else, and that was Southern hospitality, the people.
The Wrights packed up their new, larger glider and headed for Kitty Hawk. The Wrights took their first large-scale glider to Kitty Hawk in late September 1900. They brought with them 3 trunks full of camping equipment and set up a wood-frame tent on the dunes near a station of the U.S. Life-Saving Service. The biplane glider weighed 50 pounds and cost $15 to build. It had a wooden frame covered in tightly woven cotton. The Wrights tested it first as an unmanned kite, carefully recording flight data and making small modifications to improve its performance. After 3 weeks of flying the glider on a string, they enlisted Bill Tate, the local postman who had answered their initial inquiry about Kitty Hawk, to help them carry the glider to the top of a cluster of high dunes called the Kill Devil Hills. Wilbur lay down across the glider's lower wing. Orville and Tate lifted the glider and ran. As the glider started to lift, Wilbur shouted, "Let go!" They did, and Wilbur sailed gracefully down the slope. He had flown. He made about a dozen flights that day, covering a total of perhaps half a mile, with a total flight time of barely 2 minutes. The wing warping system worked. The glider could be controlled. Thrilled with their initial success, the Wrights returned to Dayton, determined to build a bigger and better glider. They studied what little data there was on lift characteristics of different wing designs, most of which came from Lilienthal's experiments. From that, they built the biggest glider ever constructed, with wings 22 feet wide and 7 feet deep. It weighed nearly 100 pounds and featured an improved steering mechanism. They returned to Kitty Hawk in July 1901 and built a wooden shed on the beach to act as their base of operations. The shed was more accommodating than the previous year's tent. However, it was also the only thing about 1901 that was an improvement over 1900. Wilbur did the flying, and almost immediately discovered that the giant wings of the new glider didn't provide as much lift as Lilienthal's data promised. The forward elevator, which controlled the up and down motion of the plane, didn't work. The Wrights spent a precious week redesigning and rebuilding the wings and elevator. It helped, but the glider in flight still had a disturbing tendency to spin wildly out of control. In what turned out to be the last manned flight of the year, Wilbur crashed, cutting his face on the elevator and badly damaging the plane. The Wrights left Kitty Hawk depressed and confused. They returned to Dayton facing a gloomy winter and questioning whether man would ever fly.
You find that when you look at the Wright brothers, they clearly understood the aeronautical research and development process as thoroughly or more than anybody in their time period. And the process that they followed to create the world's first successful airplane was a model of how people do research even in the present day.
The Wrights concluded that Lilienthal's data was wrong. If they wanted to fly, they had to throw away the articles and books and generate their own basic understanding of flight. They built a simple wind tunnel, a box 6 feet long with a fan in one end and a window on top. Using machinery designed to manufacture bicycle parts, they crafted model wings out of wax, solder, steel, and tin. They tested different shapes and spent painstaking hours documenting the minutiae of aerodynamics.
They became aware of the entire theoretical underpinnings of flight. They studied and read widely. They created specialized test equipment to validate some of their own ideas, particularly ideas on controllability.
The 1902 glider looked more like a modern airplane than anything to come before it. The wings were flatter, longer, and not as deep as the 1901 model. There were stabilizers in the rear to balance the front elevator and keep the plane from side-slipping. In late summer, the Wrights returned to Kitty Hawk and spent the first few weeks building a large hangar. They improved their living quarters, which took on decidedly homey characteristics in anticipation of a long stay. By mid-September, they had assembled the glider, and a series of short flights gave rise to optimism. On one of the first flights, with Orville at the controls, the glider spun out of control and crashed. They repaired the damage, but the sudden and unexpected banking became a recurring problem. Lying in bed considering the aerodynamic forces that could cause the crashes, Orville concluded that when the glider turned, air pressure built up along the stabilizers. He suggested that they eliminate one of the stabilizers and make the other movable to help the plane turn. The problem disappeared. The Wrights stayed in camp through late October. By the time they returned to Dayton, they had already roughed out the design of their first powered airplane. To build it, they needed a light, powerful engine. They wrote to several manufacturers, but none wanted the job. So, with the help of one of their bicycle mechanics, they built their own. On September 25, 1903, the Wrights and their newly christened flyer arrived at Kill Devil Hills. Static testing revealed critical problems with the propeller axles. They tried several fixes, but in late November, Orville returned alone to Dayton to machine new shafts. He returned on December 11th with new propeller axles and a fresh $1 bill. The bill was from their father, Milton Wright, who told them to use it to pay for the telegram announcing their success. With the plane finally ready to go, the weather failed them. Kitty Hawk, chosen for its prevailing winds, fell dead calm. Impatient, the Wrights and a few locals hauled the flyer to the top of Big Kill Devil Hill. They flipped a coin to see who would fly first. Orville won. The plane rested on a 60-foot rail that served as a runway. Wilbur ran alongside as the flyer moved forward. After a 40-foot run, it lifted off, raised its nose too high, and crashed. It took 2 days to repair the damage to the flyer. The Wrights moved the track back down off Kill Devil Hills and onto the flat sand below. The prevailing winds returned, and on December 17th they tried again. This time, it was Wilbur's turn. He slid into place atop the bottom wing. Orville stood alongside. Facing a 27-mile-an-hour wind, they started the engine. The plane moved slowly forward. After 40 feet on flat ground under its own power, the Flyer lifted off. It stayed in the air for 12 seconds before settling into the sand 120 feet away. The first powered, sustained, controlled flight had been achieved. They moved the plane back to the rail, and Orville took the controls. He too flew 13 seconds, 175 feet. Then Wilbur, 15 seconds, 200 feet. Finally, Orville, 59 seconds, covering 852 feet. The frame of the plane cracked on landing. Man's first day of flight had come to an end. With the plane safely stored in its hangar, Wilbur and Orville walked 4 miles up the beach to the Weather Bureau station at Kitty Hawk. They sent a telegram to their father. "Inform press," the telegram said.
Their brother, Lorne, when they got the telegram in Dayton, went down to the local newspaper, and the local editor read 59 seconds. He said if it had been 59 minutes, it might be newsworthy. The next day in the newspaper, the only thing was mentioned is that the Wright boys will be home for Christmas. Talking about missing the story of the century.
The Wright brothers were not naive idealists. As they had turned their tinkering into small businesses when they were boys, after their first flight at Kitty Hawk, they worked to turn their test craft into a practical flying device. Working at Huffman Prairie, a 100-acre pasture outside Dayton, the Wrights made more than 80 flights in 1904, testing and revising not just their technology, but also their technique.
Theoretically, the machine with the fuel capacity was capable of flying about 8 miles, but they had no skill. So the reason they got better each time they tried, they just increased on their abilities and their skill as being pilots.
On September 15th, 1904, Wilbur made the first complete circle of the field. In November, he flew 4 circles around Huffman Prairie, staying in the air for 5 full minutes. In the spring of 1905, the Wrights built the Flyer 3, which featured improved flight controls. That summer, they flew more than 40 successful flights. The longest lasted 39 minutes and covered more than 24 miles. The Wrights' test flights turned Huffman Prairie into a significant attraction. The crowds, while gratifying, made the brothers nervous, since they had applied for but had not been granted a patent on their wing warping system.
Now, everything that makes the airplane turn is right in front of you. There's nothing inside the wings or anything like that. So when they went back to Ohio in 1904 and 1905, there were a lot of people hanging out, trying to walk up close to the airplane and see everything works.
Fearing that someone would steal their technology, at the end of the 1905 year, the Wrights put their aircraft under wraps and kept it there. For 2.5 years, they did not fly. During that time, rumors took hold that the Wrights had never flown at all.
There was so much jealousy involved in the invention of the airplane. The Wright brothers were literally unheard of until 1899. And when they went to compete with men who had, quote, higher educated, college training, all the political backing, all the government funding, I think they were kind of resented by these people because of their lack of education.
The Wrights offered their airplane to the United States Army, and the Army declined. The government had spent more than $70,000 on Samuel Langley's failed experiments, and the idea that a couple of bicycle repairmen from Dayton could succeed where the respected Langley had failed seemed absurd. The Wrights persisted. They offered to meet strict specifications if the Army would agree in advance to buy a Wright Flyer if they succeeded. The Army refused to sign a contract until it had seen the plane fly. The Wrights wouldn't fly without the contract. The Wrights continued to work behind closed doors. Without ever testing it, they designed and built the Type A Flyer. In the Type A, the pilot sat upright, and a second seat allowed the plane to carry a passenger. In February 1908, the Army relented and gave the Wrights a contract to deliver an aircraft that could meet what seemed at the time impossible specifications. The plane had to be capable of carrying 2 men 125 miles at an average speed above 40 miles an hour. A month later, the Wrights signed a second contract with a French company to manufacture flyers in Europe. Only then did the Wrights return to flight. Still concerned about protecting their technology, they returned to Kitty Hawk. Once again in splendid isolation, they practiced in a modified 1905 flyer, carrying as a passenger a mechanic who had accompanied them from Dayton. At the end of May, Orville returned to Dayton to prepare a Type A flyer for the Army demonstration. Wilbur set sail for France to prepare for demonstration flights there. The Europeans greeted Wilbur with suspicion. On August 8th, in front of a sparse crowd at a small racetrack near Le Mans, Wilbur took off. He circled the track twice and landed smoothly. The flight lasted less than 2 minutes, and the French had never seen anything like it.
It was a mix of admiration, disappointment, shock, almost disbelief. They were measuring flights in terms of yards and meters of length. And here were the Wrights able to produce an airplane that could literally turn figure eights, stay aloft for at least a half hour or much longer than that, exhibit perfect controllability.
Every day, the crowd grew larger. In 6 months, Wilbur made 100 flights and carried more than 60 passengers. He and his airplane became a sensation. While Wilbur was knocking them dead in Paris, Orville staged the first demonstration flight for the Army. On September 3rd, 1908, at Fort Myer, he took an Army officer up for a jaunt around the base parade grounds. For 2 weeks, on opposite sides of the ocean, the two brothers seemed in a kind of competition for who could make the longest flight, who could take up the most passengers, who could draw the largest crowd. On September 17th, the competition ended. Orville, flying with Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge as his passenger, crashed. Wreckage pinned pilot and passenger to the ground. Orville suffered a fractured thigh, cracked ribs, scalp wounds, and back injuries. Selfridge died, becoming the first fatality in the new era of powered flight. 4 days later, flying over France, Wilbur set the world flight endurance record, 1 hour and 31 minutes. This, he said as he got out of the plane, will cheer Orville up.
It's sad that after 1909-1910 time period, we see the Wrights really drop out of the aeronautics business. Wilbur, of course, dies in 1912. But one has the feeling that the Wrights really had reached the end of their creative tether, if you will.
The Wrights flew a few public stunts, including a flight up the Hudson River in New York City. They opened a company to manufacture Wright flyers and concentrated not on research, but on protecting their patents. Exhausted from one of many patent infringement trials, Wilbur contracted typhoid fever. He returned to Dayton too weak to fight, and after 3 weeks at home, died in 1912.
When Wilbur died, part of Orville died too. He lost all interest in the airplane industry. There'd be no more great inventions, no more genius thoughts.
Orville sold his interest in the Wright Airplane Company for $1.5 million. He retired to a mansion on the outskirts of Dayton. He flew for the last time in 1918, as his invention was proving itself on the battlefields of Europe. He was nearly invisible, appearing only occasionally at ceremonies honoring his and his brother's work. He died in 1948 at the age of 76, less than a year after Chuck Yeager became the first man to break the sound barrier. The machine he and his brother had invented had truly changed the world.
At the turn of the 20th century in Dayton, Ohio, Hawthorne Street looked much as it does today. Men and women are still living who remember how in the years 1900, 1901, 1902, 1903, the quiet, slow-spoken Wright brothers came walking down Hawthorne, back again from their journeys to Kitty Hawk, and how with that bent, alert, probing way of theirs, they strode past the homes of Vance the harness maker, Pahoo the stone cutter, Wellborn the wagon maker, Wolfram the carriage trimmer. Year after year they came quietly home to number 7 Hawthorne Street. But once within the house, reserve left them. With their father, Bishop Milton Wright, their sister Catherine, or the young girl Carrie Grumbach listening unobtrusively, the Wright brothers studied aloud, discussed exhaustively, argued in detail, and at last conceived the principles that were to open the skies to the navigation of men. Around the corner from Hawthorne on 4th Street, Orville and Wilbur Wright tested not only their ideas, but they examined the theories of other men who had explored the possibilities of flight: Cayley, Lilienthal, Chanute, Langley. The Wrights devised methods of measuring the accuracy of aeronautical theories, including their own. The home was their discussion hall, the shop their laboratory. Both today are gone from Dayton, moved as monuments to the Wright memory to the museum at Greenfield Village in Dearborn. Discussion hall, laboratory, and testing devices such as their first wind tunnel had their place. But the Wrights at once had recognized an axiom of aviation that still endures: proof must come in the air. On this windswept beach in 1900, 1901, and 1902, they tested gliders they had built. They taught themselves to be pilots of a high order. They were critical men, but at last, their 1902 model pleased them. They flew it farther and with better control than any other glider that man had ever devised. They came back from Kitty Hawk in 1902 with the knowledge that they had solved flight's paramount secret, control. And in the spring of 1903, they designed a 4-cylinder engine and fashioned 2 propellers. When they next went to Kitty Hawk, they flew. On December 17, 1903, Orville and Wilbur Wright made man's first 4 controlled flights in a powered airplane. That day, they lifted the world into a new dimension.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunk Works' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. for more amazing aerial footage. And to join us in this incredible journey, check out the Dronescapes YouTube channel.
The only reason for an airplane to exist is to go fast. At the Great Air Meet in Rheims, Glenn Curtiss set a world's record of just over 43 miles an hour, and the quest for speed was on. In 1913, Maurice Prévost was flying a streamlined Dépôt-Dassin monoplane at 126 miles an hour, and Europe claimed the lead in aviation speed. Immediately after World War I, quest for speed became a catalyst for the development of fighter planes. Countries which had not invested in new engines for their wartime fighters would, for reasons of national pride, invest in new engines to race them peacetime. Then, in America in the 1930s, the situation reversed itself. Civilian aircraft, like the Travel Air Mystery Ship and the GB, Waddell Williams racers, became even faster than military aircraft. The reason was simple. Same engines were available to both civil racers and military fighters. The fighters had to carry guns, bombs, oxygen, and radios, while the racers were built only for speed. The world's absolute speed record was passed from country to country. And as the racers became faster and more powerful, they also became more expensive. America's Howard Hughes could afford to build his own racer, and with it set a land-plane speed record. But the absolute speed record of 440 miles an hour was set by a Macchi MC-72 seaplane in 1934, financed by the Italian government. Then military aircraft came back into the lead as the Heinkel and Messerschmitt firms competed for the title. Messerschmitt Bf-109R set a speed record of 469 miles an hour in 1939, a record that lasted for many years. When the jet aircraft came out, speed records rapidly accelerated, the British breaking 1,000 miles an hour in 1956 in a Fairey Delta II. Speeds continued to climb, finally reaching 2,193 miles an hour in 1976 by the Lockheed SR-71, alias Blackbird. While speed was the object, there were many other benefits in creating ever faster aircraft. Improvement in fuels, streamlining, lubricants, materials, and the list goes on. Speed produced not only prestige and pleasure, but also utility. The speed record setters ultimately paved the way for commercial transports, business jets, and private planes.